Ladies and gentlemen, buckle up because our guest today was a Muslim who did undercover counterterrorism work in many capacities with the U.S. government. Her name is Hedieh Miramadi, and Hedieh served 5 presidents over 20 years at very high levels. She's been deployed in many hostile countries, and she has some really great insights into what the U.S. has been trying to do in Muslim countries to stem the Islamic jihadist extremism. Hedieh knows what works. She knows what doesn't work in counterterrorism, and she knows where we are now with national security, open borders, and the future of the West in light of the encroaching geopolitical movement known as Islam. In addition to all that, Hedieh has her law degree, and most importantly, is now a Christian who heads resurrectministry.com, resurrectministry.com. More on that in a few minutes. And I first learned of Hedieh because she appeared on the podcast of my friend Jack Hibbs just a few weeks ago. You know, Jack, the pastor of Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills. We just had Jack on a live stream called How to Love Your Neighbor Through Politics. Check that out. Anyway, I thought the conversation between Jack and Hedieh was so interesting that I wanted to introduce you folks here to Hedieh and to expand the conversation she had with Jack. So here she is, ladies and gentlemen. Hedieh joins the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast and radio program. How are you, Hedieh?
I am fantastic. Thank you so much for bringing me on the show. It's an honor.
Well, it's an honor to talk to you because I learned so much listening to you and Jack talk about your work for the U.S. government, both as an employee and as a contractor. Let's start at the beginning. Your parents came from Iran in the 60s, but you're born in the United States. How did you ever get into counterterrorism? How did that happen?
To make a very long story short, I was raised secular. My parents were not religious growing up. It wasn't until college that I got introduced to Islam, and based on my personal, just kind of yearning for a relationship with God, Islam was a natural fit. It was culturally the same as my family, and so it felt like a logical place to start. And I met a boy, he takes me to a mosque, and I thought to myself, wow, this is really extreme. The mosque I happened to fall into was one that was preaching this cultural jihad. It was an Ikhwani, a Muslim Brotherhood mosque, and it was basically all about changing America to a Muslim nation. Totally unappealing to me, strange, but unappealing. And I ended up—
Where was this, Hedieh? What mosque, what town was this?
I'm in Southern California.
Okay. Was this the Culver City Mosque by any chance?
No, it's down in Los Angeles proper.
Okay.
So it's not in Culver City. It's a little farther down. Southern California, it's called Islamic Center.
So you went there, and what year would this be?
This is 1992 about.
Okay. So this is long before 9/11. This is 9 years before 9/11.
Yes.
It's even before some other terrorist attacks overseas.
Yes.
So
the major one that we were involved in for the United States was 98. Other than the World Trade Center bombing that didn't take down the towers.
1993, right?
92?
Yeah, 93. Yeah.
93.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of off the radar at this point. Islamic terrorism.
Well, it was off the radar, but I was what they were selling I wasn't buying. So it was very anti-Semitic. It was, we need to conquer America. I grew up very patriotic. My father was a bundler for the Republican Party. So I was very involved. I contributed to campaigns. I interned. I walked districts for local politicians. So I didn't want to fight the power. That's not what I was looking for. So when I showed my disdain for this movement, I was introduced to a more spiritual sect, which was known as Sufism. And that's ultimately where I spent the next 2+ decades. And it was in that community that I learned about this unraveling of Islam to supplant normative cultural Islam that existed in many, many places of the world. That was the majority of Muslim countries, with this dogmatic, jihadist, conquer the world kind of form of the religion. And when I discovered that form was in conflict with the form that I was now a part of, I wanted to better understand what was happening. So Fast forward a couple years, I am graduated from law school. I'm looking for a career. I start researching Islamic extremism. The more I find out, like socially from this community, the more I wanted to understand. And so I started to interview everyday people at the mosque. Why are you interested in the conflict? What's going on in Bosnia? What's happening in Afghanistan? The civil war between Afghanistan. Ayman al-Zawahiri is fundraising in San Francisco at a mosque. And so I was interviewing the people that had attended those fundraising and those events. In that interaction, I come across 2 FBI agents who are also trying to figure out what's going on. And so repeated interactions where they see me, I didn't notice them at first, but they see me. And so they're asking me, why are you here? What are you doing? And of course I respond with, what are you doing? And that's basically where the friendship began. So my career in counterterrorism started as an informant, where I was basically helping them understand what was happening in the community. And it was basically a side project for them because the federal government was not focused on Islamic terrorism. And to be frank, we were kind of supporting these groups. So it wasn't considered an enemy of the West. You know, bin Laden was originally funded by the CIA as a bulwark against communism. So this wasn't on anyone's radar to be a threat against the United States. And so that's basically where I started.
So you as a volunteer going into mosques, sort of just as a worshiper, but you're undercover. How are you being paid?
Well, you are paid as an informant.
Right, but you just became one sort of serendipitously, right? You didn't go to the FBI and said, hey, I want to go in there and get some info for you. They just happened to see you. Why didn't they think you were just a normal worshiper?
A couple of conversations. I don't know. I guess they thought I was quick-witted and I spoke really good English, and I was obviously, I don't know, I guess they just vetted me over a couple of interactions. I mean, I stayed friends with those guys for 20 plus years. So they trusted me and we just went from there. I guess I was trustworthy until I wasn't. And basically they didn't find any reason not to trust me.
All right. So this is long before 9/11.
Yes.
You're being paid as an informant. You keep just going to these mosques. You're feeding the FBI information. It's not a high priority item, but they are paying you to do this. What happened when 9/11 hit?
Well, before 9/11, I become so entranced by this, and the community I'm a part of is so interested in what I'm doing and basically distinguishing between mainstream and radical Islam. I moved to DC to basically be more involved in representing the community. And this is 1990. I move in about 96, 95, 96. The Tanzania-Kenya bombings come out 1998. And we happen to be hosting a conference talking about extremism. So from there, CNN broadcasted from our conference. And the State Department found out about what we were doing based on the CNN broadcast. We were invited to do an open forum, and that's where the relationship with the State Department starts.
So you're a 1099 to the FBI. Now suddenly you're about to be employed by the State Department.
Yes, and the informants are not 1099.
Okay. Well, that's just kind of business ease we use here. You're either an employee or you're not.
Bags of money that are past hands.
Okay, I get it. IRS, don't listen to this.
Yes.
Right? Okay.
The FBI contractor part comes when you actually, I became a Beltway bandit. So you basically end up getting paid by NGOs that are paying you from U.S. government money to perform a function.
Okay.
So we're basically the people on the periphery. So whenever you're not in government, when you're a federal contractor, you're basically getting money through a cutout.
All right.
To do things that the government doesn't necessarily want to do directly.
So they want to kind of wash their hands of it, pay a non-government organization to actually do what the government wants them to do. It's almost like, I hate to say it, money laundering. They don't want.
Well, you're not laundering. You're not giving it back to them. You're giving the product
that's true.
Back. You're not laundering it for them to basically use it later for diapers.
That's true. But they don't want to be connected to it. Okay, I get it. All right. Well, a lot more with Hedieh Miramadi. You're not going to want to miss our conversation. This is going to be very interesting. So don't go anywhere. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turek, on the American Family Radio Network. Back in 2 minutes. If you're low on the FM dial looking for National Public Radio, go no further. We're actually going to tell you the truth here. You will never hear this on NPR. We're talking to Hedieh Miramadi, and she, for about 20 years, worked in many capacities in counterterrorism, both inside and outside the United States government, served 5 presidents over 20 years at very high levels. She also has her law degree. She now heads a ministry called resurrectministry.com. Resurrectministry.com. All right, Hedieh, let's pick it up right where we left off. So there are some jihadist attacks in 1998. President Clinton was president at that time. I think I remember him sending missiles somewhere as a result of that.
Yes.
And then what happened? Yeah, the State Department discovers what you're doing. What happens after that?
Yeah, so I basically do a number of speaking engagements for high-level national security advisors, other federal contractors that are off the grid, Congress, events for the State Department. There's an International Religious Freedom Roundtable, a whole variety of projects that are basically calling attention to extremism, but really it's still very low key. People don't want to, especially the Clintons, they didn't want to publicly talk about Islamic extremism. It was very uncomfortable. It was still an uncomfortable truth. To this day, I think it's still an uncomfortable truth. But back then, it was definitely something that was on the down low. Mm-hmm. But once 9/11 hit, it was, I was cool before it was cool. So it was catapulted my career. I ended up going to Afghanistan. I served as a political officer under Ambassador Khalilzad. And then when I came back, I went to a couple of think tanks. So in DC, before all this commotion and the acrimony between the Trump administration and the rest of the government, when the Republicans went out, you would go sit in a think tank, you would do some work, you would think big thoughts. And then when your administration came back, you'd come back, and then the Democrats would go into the think tanks. And so we did this over and over and over again based on whatever administration was in power. So we were still doing the work. It was just the capacity in which we did it, if that makes sense.
Now, coming up to 9/11, was there any sort of mild warning signs that a big attack was coming? Do you recall?
Oh, absolutely. I got myself involved in a very difficult one because the State Department came out against us and literally I was banned for a short time from the State Department because of it, because it's kind of a little complicated, but the president of Chechnya, Maskhadov, had come to our conference, and he basically was trying to alert the U.S. government that bin Laden was planning an attack against the United States, that he was transporting suitcase nukes, that he was recruiting jihadists to basically launch this attack against the West. Well, we were accused, it was in national papers, international papers, that this is a Spectre bazaar, that we were claiming that bin Laden was doing this. And so it was extremely ill-received. I can't even tell you. Members of Congress thought we were crazy. It was a really difficult time until, of course, 9/11 hit and people were like, oh, how did you know that? So it was a precarious time.
Then in the period right after 9/11, what was your role, say, for the first 2 or 3 years after that?
So a lot of it was, so President Bush, I don't know how much people recall, but he had this whole thing about why do they hate us and promoting democracy. And if we promoted democracy in the Middle East, people would like us better. Right. So they sent a bunch of us out all over the world, basically talking about being an American Muslim, how great it was. Why do you hate us? Let's talk about it. There were these trips of goodwill to other Muslim nations. And for the most part, they were a disaster. Other nations were extremely unfriendly. They said I was bolder than most because most people would just kind of cow to whatever pressure the locals were giving. I wouldn't. I refused to because I knew enough about Islamic extremism to hold my own in an argument. But it was a very long effort. And then I went to Afghanistan, and when I came back, we were gearing up for the war in Iraq.
Okay, so the idea that we're going to somehow bring democracy to Muslim nations that have been Muslim nations for, in some cases, centuries, why is that a fool's errand?
To this day, I don't know if people were just stupid or it was intentional, because it really did lead to the entire unraveling of the Middle East. It led to all the mass migration we see now throughout Europe, and I'm sure we'll get to that conversation. But at the time, it felt like the U.S. diplomatic corps was at its foundation atheists. So they couldn't understand the power of theology. They couldn't understand people that lived with an eternity in mind, because they weren't Christians. So they were secularists, they were atheists. So they didn't understand the power of theology to motivate people to do something for decades and centuries. So when those of us were trying to explain, listen, this doesn't work because they have a global expansionist faith that requires them to destroy you, ultimately. That sounded silly or stupid. And so they're like, you just don't understand the way the world works. We understand the way the world works. We give somebody some money. We give them a good life. We build wells. They'll like us. They'll end up just like us. You know, and none of the people that were there, because it was more than just me, tried to convince them that this doesn't work in the Middle East. Nobody accepted it. The powers that be did not accept it.
Hedieh, did any of them study the last 1,400 years of Islamic history?
Remember, at the time also, Bernard Lewis, who was a great, historian, was an advisor to many of these officials. But it still didn't sink in. So even though there were people like him who were very clear about the ideology, people that had the power to move this massive machinery that is the U.S. government didn't buy into it.
And do you think, let's fast forward.
Sure. Right
now, the Biden administration, do they think the same way? We can democratize the Muslim world?
This seems much more insidious. This seems much more insidious to me, because and maybe it's because I'm not sitting in on those conversations, because I know when I sat in on the conversations, I just felt that they were being stubborn, and that they really passionately believed what they were doing. But now the way we're treating the borders and the way we're causing this mass migration into Western countries, it seems like the ultimate goal is not the result of not understanding the Middle East. It's a result of wanting this kind of Marxist globalist control, because they need to undermine. So this is exactly what the jihadists do in Muslim countries. You have to deconstruct the cultural fabric of that country. So way before the jihadists came for the West, they were destroying Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So those millions and millions of Muslims that had a normative practice of Islam, in order to remove that normative practice and supplant a jihadist ideology, you had to destroy the infrastructure. So you had to basically stop the tribal leaders, hang them from trees for 3 days till their corpses smelled, scare everybody out of their minds. You had to stop the civil society infrastructure that existed at the grassroots, whatever that may be, and replace it with people of your own persuasion. So that's what I see happening here too, is that we're basically trying to dilute. They use the term MAGA extremists, but if we could all put aside the incendiary nature of that term and just say American Christians, then you could better understand what they're doing. They're trying to demonize American Christians, because they want to replace us with the globalist Marxist party and their people.
Yet, if I understand radical Islam to any degree, they're just in bed with the Marxists until they can take over, and then they'll do away with the Marxists as well. Do you agree?
Absolutely. But they learned the organizational skills. The Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, learned from the Marxist movement in Egypt. So that alliance between the left and the Islamists has existed for decades. They learned how to organize. They learned how to gain control of a society. They learned influence operations. They learned terrorism tactics. All of that they learned from Marxist ideology.
But why would Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, okay, you know Kamala Harris leans Marxist, but Joe Biden, first of all, has kind of been all over the map. But if you were to look back on his career, say 20 years ago, he'd be considered kind of a middle of the road leftist senator, but not a Marxist, not a way left guy. No. What happened? He's not calling the shots. Why is the border open?
I don't think he's calling the shots. Based on, I know a lot of people in this administration. I worked with them back in the Obama days. So, you know, before Trump comes in, you know, these are all the same players, Lisa Monaco, actually even Kirby. I worked with Kirby a lot in the Defense Department. So
John Kirby, was he a naval officer, or he was a,
yes.
Okay.
So he was an executive in the Department of Defense.
Right. Okay. So
yeah.
Is he a one world government guy, or are there these people? What are they? What are they doing?
I didn't think so. When I knew him, I tell my husband all the time, when I look at the TV, I was like, I don't know what happened to him. He was normal 10 years ago. So a lot of these people, I don't understand what's happening, but I just think that the only thing I can explain it is that besides the demonic force, so we can't deny, we're Christians, we understand there's a demonic force at play here, pushing people. And I think that's also, combine the demonic force with money. So there's a lot of money at stake in this apparatus. So the military industrial complex, when we say that, when we say we're giving billions of dollars to Ukraine, we are not giving billions of dollars to Ukraine. We're giving billions of dollars to American contractors to play footsies in Ukraine. So they get a couple of guns that we make. They get a couple of planes and missiles and artillery that we make, and they get to play cops and robbers. But at the end of the day, that money is funneled back to our country. So they have all of these people with these special interests, whether it's money, ideology, or just plain hatred of anything that's backed by God. And they've all united forces. And it's this confluence of evil and negative forces that is driving this machinery. And so when people tell me, I'm sorry, but I get really frustrated when some politicians or commentators are like, well, Trump needs to go in and fire 75% of the government. That's impossible. You can't fire 75%. First of all, they're under contract. It's illegal to do that.
Well, we're going to see if anything can be done about the demise of the West right after the break with my guest, Hedieh Miramadi. As you can see, she's very knowledgeable. She's been on the inside on counterterrorism and geopolitical operations. So don't go anywhere. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turek, back in 2 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the biggest differences between Christianity and Islam is the resurrection of Jesus. Did it really happen? We've actually created a brand new course, myself and Dr. Michael Licona. It's going to start in October. It's called Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? Evidence and Objections for the Modern Mind. Go to crossexamine.org, click on online courses. You'll see it there. If you take the premium version, you'll be live with Mike and me on several occasions for Zoom Q&As. Also want to mention there's a lot of events coming up next week. On the 24th, September 24th, we'll be at McNeese State University. That's in Louisiana near Lake Charles. And it's open to anybody. We'll also live stream it. The next night, we'll be at Little Cypress Mauriceville High School. That's in Texas, just over the line. We will have that live streamed. And the night after that, pray my voice holds out, Lamar University, Beaumont, Texas. That's the 26th of, September. The following week, I'll be at Rock Point Church the evening of October 1st. All of that will be live streamed. We'll also live stream the next new Bible study on the 30th of September. So check our calendar for more on that. And thanks for your support. To do these college and high school events, we don't charge students a dime. We raise money to do it. You make it happen. And then we live stream it to reach thousands of others. So thanks so much. We're talking to my guest today, Hedieh, who has been inside the government and outside the government in counterterrorism roles over 20 years, serving 5 presidents. And Hedieh, before the break, we were talking about Ukraine, and we were talking about money, that people want that war to go on so money can come back to us. Talk a little bit about disinformation, because a lot of governments practice disinformation. First of all, what is it, and what's your experience with it?
It is strange to watch the shift in our government. I think what is really important for your listeners to understand is there is no crime or law against lying. And that is a foundational principle of the marketplace of ideas. Our First Amendment freedoms are based on the idea that people can say dumb things, bad things, ugly things, and that we believe as a society, we will choose the right things over the bad things or the wrong things. When people want to start criminalizing or legislating, or our government officials want to legislate against disinformation, what they're saying is, you American people are not smart enough to decide what's true and what's false, what's good and what's bad. Because disinformation is basically a projected falsehood from one person or two people, whatever's perspective. It's from a perspective. So they could basically say Jesus rising from the dead is disinformation. That's their perspective. There's only 2 genders. That's disinformation. Anything can be disinformation from a certain perspective. That's why in this country, we don't have laws against hate speech. We have laws against violence. So it's the Brandenburg test from the KKK back in the 70s, I believe, where if your speech is causing an imminent threat of harm, you cannot yell fire in a theater. But if, barring that, an imminent threat of harm, you can lie and say ugly things all you want. And the fact that we're now saying that that is a threat to this democracy and to our society, Christians better be careful, because we're the first ones on the chopping block if that goes through. Because everything we say is unpalatable. It is foolishness to those who are perishing. And we really have to understand what's at stake.
You know what I think is disinformation that comes out of our government? And maybe you disagree with this, but that's okay. If you did, it would be disinformation, Hedieh. No, I think it's not just our government, but a lot of times it comes out of our government that we have to combat Islamophobia. Because I think Islamophobia is a bogus term. And the reason I say that is because Islam is not a race. Islam is an ideology. And there are people of all different, I know there's one race, the human race, but we'll use it in the way people normally use it. There are all different races of people who are Muslims. And nobody should oppose Islam because different races may be Muslims, but we might want to oppose Islam if they want to say bring Sharia law to the United States, or they want to bring jihad to the United States. I don't think that we ought to accept Sharia law. It's unconstitutional. Obviously, we don't want jihad here. Yet I think too many people try and smear opposition to Sharia law and jihad by calling it Islamophobia when it makes good sense to be against Sharia law and jihad. What are your thoughts on that?
You're absolutely right. The extreme version of this. So first of all, we did a lot of work on Islamic terrorism, especially when ISIS was on the rise in 2015. And every step we took, we were accused by the Islamist organizations of being Islamophobic. You're Islamophobic. You're just trying to persecute Islam. It's basically a way of shutting up your opponents. So we're seeing it now in Europe. We're seeing it in the UK. They're basically putting people in prison for reposting social media posts about riots because they say it's Islamophobic or it's causing racial tensions. Because when people want to speak out and tell the truth about something that's happening in their towns or their neighborhoods, if you slap a label of discrimination against it, then everybody becomes afraid of speaking out because they don't want to be labeled.
Can you help us understand what is going on with the riots in the UK? Because it seems like some people are upset that Islam and Sharia law is encroaching on them, taking their freedoms away from them. And then there are some people who are saying, well, we can't stand for this. We've got to fight against this. What's going on over there? Can you tell us?
Absolutely. So I spent a lot of time in the UK. I was actually funded by the UK government as well to build a moderate opposition to the Islamists. It was not successful, by the way. But this, what you're seeing now is the culmination of mass migration of populations of people from communities and countries that are antithetical to the West. In other words, they came after the color revolutions of Libya, all throughout Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. And so they've lost their home countries as a result of the wars, and now they're migrating to Europe. And they're hostile, they're angry, they didn't want to migrate. It's not like my parents who came in the 60s to live the American dream. It's not because they're trying to live a dream. They're there because their homelands were destroyed and because they think that they're going to have better opportunities in Europe. But at the back of their mind, when they're Muslims, they always have the idea that Islam will be victorious. It's a global expansionist ideology. Their goal is to overcome the Jews and the Christians and to dominate that society, even if it's not by violence. So that's ultimately the goal. Just as Rome fell, the West will fall. And so if you combine that into these small pockets, these countries with much smaller square footage than we have here in the United States, there's a culture war that's happening with the indigenous British population and these immigrants. And as a consequence, and not only that, but because of the speed at which they're migrating, they don't have jobs available for them. They don't learn the language, the native language. And so what do? They form gangs. So they're the child traffickers. They call them South Asian gangs because they don't want to call them Muslim gangs, but they're made up of Pakistanis. And they traffic in women, they traffic in drugs. So they're degrading the society with criminality in addition to destroying it culturally. And I'm sure your listeners have heard at this point of no-go zones. Some of those places in England, even as a Muslim, I wouldn't travel to, where they told me I needed a mahram, I needed a male escort to go to South Hall because I would be harassed by the locals for being an unaccompanied female.
I'll tell you, the one time I was in Paris, we were driving around and we took a wrong turn, and Hedieh, I thought I was in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
I mean, suddenly we're in this neighborhood. Everybody's covered. It was a transformation just over a block or two.
Yes.
And it was like, how do we get out of this neighborhood? It's like we're sticking out here. We're not in Paris.
It's scary.
Yes.
And then can you imagine living in that? So what you see in these riots, I think, and it reminds me of the problem of J6, where there was thousands of people who went to protest what they thought was an unfair election. That's a democratic right. That's a right as Americans. But what happened? You had a bunch of agitators in there. You had people that were there to cause trouble. You had government provocateurs. And that's the same thing we're seeing in the Europe riots, where they're just angry British people that want to complain and protest what their government's doing. And yet there's all these agitators that are included in the mix. And then at the end of the day, it ends up overblown and the government wants to clamp down and they go too far and it ends up creating an even bigger problem.
So when you say government provocateurs on January 6th, what do you mean by that?
I mean, I'm of the opinion there were people there that were provoking the crowd. So, I've been on the other side of that and what it's like to be an informant. And I mean, you're not on the books, so to speak. So there are plenty of people that they could have had in that audience because it's just, I mean, if you've been to enough of these rallies, you know, for the most part, these people are not engaged in violence at all. They're actually quite they're quite friendly people. And so the commotion that we saw does not look indicative of the movement.
Well,
frankly.
It's certainly not an insurrection. It's the only insurrection in history without any weapons.
Without weapons.
Right.
Exactly.
And if you look at the video that the January 6th committee hid, because it was a political kangaroo court, hid from the American public, was the video of Capitol Police escorting Buffalo Man through the Capitol and escorting people as if they're on a tour. Now, obviously, there was some things they did they shouldn't have done. It was about 100 stupid people that went into the Capitol when they shouldn't have. But you're saying, in your opinion, there were some provocateurs there that instigated them on. And of course, they couldn't overthrow the United States government with a Buffalo Man staff or whatever the guy had. I mean, it now has flipped. And what I want to ask you when we come back from the break, Hedieh, is because you pointed this out in your conversation with Jack Hibbs, there was a point where the focus of the United States government flipped from Islamic terrorism to domestic terrorism. And they define domestic terrorists now as moms going to a school board meeting or anybody who is conservative. What about that? What can we do about it? A lot more with Hedieh Miramadi, an attorney and also somebody who's worked in counterterrorism for 20 years. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turek, back in 2 minutes. When and why did the United States government flip their emphasis from looking out for Islamic terrorism to looking out for what they consider to be domestic terrorism, which unfortunately has turned out just to be conservatives? When did this happen? Why did this happen? I remember Hedieh, and by the way, my guest, Hedieh Miramadi, go back to the beginning of the show for her bio, quite impressive. But Hedieh, I remember back in the Obama administration, there was a lady by the name of Lois Lerner at the IRS who the Obama administration used to target conservatives.
Yes.
And it seemed to be like this is where it really began to be noticed. When did all this flip from Islamic terrorism to now we're going after conservatives? They're the bigger threat.
So by all indication, I was still at FBI headquarters in 2016. So by all indication, the entire law enforcement apparatus, DHS, DOJ, FBI, everything shifted once Trump was elected. I know because I was funded and we were building programs. I was building terrorism prevention programs across the United States with the FBI. So I know that's what our focus was up until Trump's elected. Once Trump's elected and in office as an FBI, I was a personal services contractor, which is a quasi-employee sitting at headquarters. I was not allowed to go over to the White House. We were forbidden unless we had a special detail or permission from Andy McCabe or others to go over there. We weren't even allowed to go over there. So there was a complete shift to Russia. You know, we spent years in that investigation. And I think when you fast forward from that change all the way up now through Biden, the entire Islamic terrorism apparatus that I and several others, you know, dozens of contractors built was basically turned on its head. We were never allowed to use the word Islam in the violent extremism portfolio. We always talked about it in non-religious terms, but all of us knew that that's what it was directed at. But
okay, why can't you call it what it is?
Because a couple of NGOs would scream in the media and the whole thing would get shut down. And there are some very cleverly placed Islamist plants over in justice and other branches of the U.S. government where every time you try to get policy through, they bounce it.
Okay, but Obama started all of this, like maybe in a minor way, going after conservatives through the IRS. But you're saying the big shift was the deep state decided that once Trump got elected, we need to take him down and we're going to use the power of
Law
our
enforcement.
the DOJ, the FBI, all the groups in Homeland Security, whoever it is. Now we're going after Trump. Why?
Yes, and the whole Titanic the whole thing just shifted. And once you do that, a lot of good people retired. A lot of people just left the service. And so then you not only have a shift in focus away from Islamic terror, but you now have a whole new cadre of people that agree with the mission, because the people who didn't agree with the mission left. And you combine that with a poor allocation of resources, where resources are no longer allocated to the proper threat factors and threat actors. And then you have the debacle we had in Pennsylvania and now in Florida with attempted assassinations that really look like a circus show. It's some of the stupidest security failures that most of us have ever seen, and are a result of these three factors: the poor allocation of resources, we're not looking at the right threat actors. The FBI has the capability to know what you ate for breakfast. They know what street you take to drive your daughter to school. They know absolutely everything about you when you are a threat actor. Once you are on their radar and you are a threat actor, they know your movements. But if they're not counting you as a threat, then how do they know? So when it's focused on moms and Catholics, and moms at the school board, and on Catholics that go to, mass that supports a Latin mass,
or go to abortion clinics and try and save babies. Clinics
instead of this guy like Ryan, who's part of the 𝗍𝗢𝗠𝗢𝗡𝗏 battalion, who's coming across the border with on a plane ride from Ukraine with AK-47s possibly in his luggage. Then you don't catch people like that because you're not focused on them. So it's not that our apparatus isn't capable; it's that it's not focused on it.
Okay, but Hedieh, you seem to forget that roof was just too slopey. They couldn't put somebody up there. You know that. Come on, please.
He could stay up there, but nobody else could.
Yeah,
right? Because he's Spider-Man.
I mean, could it be an inside job? I mean, the first one, how do you leave that roof unattended? It defies. A third grader would go, there could be somebody up there. But see, how does this happen?
But see, that's the thing. So that's the thing is that you have poor levels of training. So these are people like, the head of the operation had apparently failed her test before. So you just have low level people with no skills and criminal negligence. You're basically, Tucker gave the example. If you leave your kid at home in the pool and you go to Walmart, did you kill your baby? So if your mistakes are so egregious that the consequences are expected, are you still guilty of them? Yes, you are.
Well, it's almost, and I heard you say this on another talk, that it almost makes you cynical of everything the government does, because they're not telling the truth, especially when it comes to Islam. They've illegitimately shifted their focus to conservatives in America, whether they're pro-life advocates, like that one gentleman, I'm trying to remember what state he was in, where they raided his home. Right. Because he was a pro-life leader, a Catholic pro-life leader. They went in full FBI mode, knocking doors down at, 6 a.m, waking up his wife and 6 kids.
Yes.
This
like
is...
They did the grandmas who attended the J6 rally.
J6, yeah. This is when your government now is coming after you. And it's scary to think that these people now are in control and they have the powers of the DOJ. Why is Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, why did he deem school moms who are bringing up valid concerns about curriculum and pornographic material, why is he calling them domestic terrorists?
See, that's the thing, is that when you don't have people, when all your good, skilled, smart agents leave, and then you're recruiting a whole new cadre of people, or the ones that stay agree with the mission of destroying conservatives, destroying the Christian right. In we're not even talking extremists. We're just talking about American Christians, conservatives. If they're bent on destroying it and they agree with that mission, you could basically find anything on anyone. I mean, you'd be surprised at what we can find on people based on just their regular living patterns. And so whether it's think about it this way. If you knew that the government had every single email and every single conversation you had, could they twist some of the things you've said?
Oh, yeah. They don't need, easily.
Who
was it who said, who was it who said, show me the man, I'll show you the crime? Was that
exactly.
J. Edgar Hoover or somebody like that? Yeah.
That's the point. And that's how they're able to go after these people is that, they find out whether it's, somebody cheated on a spouse or they cheated on their taxes or they said, I'm going to kill that guy in jest.
Mm-hmm.
They could drum up anything when you're in the center of the bullseye.
Well, we're going to have another conversation next Tuesday, Hedieh, because we're not going to be able to complete our conversation here. I have so many more questions about anti-Semitism, Israel and Hamas. What can we do about any of this? What do you think about the border? If you were president, what would you do about the border? Looking at it as objectively as possible, who would be better on national security, a Trump or a Harris administration? I want to ask you all that, but we're running out of time here. So tell people, and then in the next conversation, we'll talk about how you became a Christian. We haven't even talked about that yet. You went from Islam to Christianity. How did that happen? But tell people about the ministry you have now, just so we can get that out on the table. Resurrect Ministry. What's that all about?
ResurrectMinistry.com. I met Jesus online. I met Jesus on YouTube. So
wow. Okay.
Yes, I had nobody witness to me.
He's got a lot of followers on YouTube. Yeah. Well, who was it? Who was the preacher? Do you remember?
Yeah, Pastor Furtick, Stephen Furtick of Elevation.
Oh yeah, he's here in Charlotte. Yeah. So he said something about the gospel, and
it was just a simple gospel. Believe him, repent, turn, and you'll be saved. And I was like, saved? What is this, Jesus? I blew my mind. It was just the simple message of salvation that attracted me.
And now you go to Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills. Is that right? Yes,
Pastor Jack Hibbs is my pastor for sure. Thank God, because it really grounded me in the Word and taught me so much about faith and how important that is, and learning the full counsel of God and expository teaching, going chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And so the ministry is basically providing an opportunity for people to meet Christ where they are. So I say, whether you're a princess walled up in a palace in Dubai or a housewife in Southern California, you can meet Jesus where you are. He met me, he'll meet you. You have just have an open heart and be able to listen to the messages and listen to worship music, pick up a Bible. And most importantly, I like people to reach out to me. I've spoken to mothers all over the world that are struggling with children going into Islam and basically helping them come out. And also young women that are leaving Islam. They tend to be young, thank God, leaving Islam, coming to Christ. And so basically discipling them and helping them as much as I can as well.
Well, we're going to put all this information in the show notes, ladies and gentlemen, including Hedieh's website, where you can find her, and you're not going to want to miss the next conversation. If you're listening on the American Family Radio Network, you will not hear it on AFR. Find the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast on Tuesday, and you'll hear our continuing conversation with Hedieh Miramadi. Don't miss it. Also go to resurrectministry.com. Don't forget, we got several live events, live stream events coming up this week and next. Check the website. See you here next week. God bless.